Loki is the latest installment for the MCU on Disney Plus. I can't believe we've gotten 3 Disney Plus Marvel shows in 1 year. Let's talk about this first episode. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. My name is Anthony A. Perez, and if you're new here to the channel, I talk about all things movies, TV, Star Wars, and all other fun stuff here on the channel. And yeah, in this episode, we're going to be talking about the first episode of the Loki series that's on Disney Plus now, the latest Marvel Cinematic Universe television show, once again having Tom Hiddleston reprise his role in the titular role of Loki. And yeah, when I heard that this show was happening after we've seen the character die in Avengers Infinity War, I was very curious to see what they were going to do. They announced back when the show was first announced, though, that this was going to be the Loki that escaped with the Tesseract during the whole time travel heist for the Infinity Stones in Avengers Endgame. So yeah, right out of the gate, there will be spoilers in this video, as I usually do with my Disney Plus reviews. So if you have not seen this episode and you definitely want to, and you don't want any spoilers, I definitely recommend go ahead and leave this video and come back after you've seen the episode. But if you're here and you don't care about spoilers, or you've already seen the episode, let's get into this. So when I heard that this was going to take place with that Loki, I started to get just a little bit confused with the whole time travel element. And I can't lie, I still find it to be a bit convoluted in the MCU. You know, time travel has been done in so many different ways, in so many different things, and a lot of times it has its own explanation for said movie or said universe, said franchise, whatever the case may be. And with the MCU, the way they explained it in Avengers Endgame via the Ancient One telling the Hulk is that whenever you go back in time or go forward in time and make any changes, that line kind of just sparks off and branches off another timeline. So that original timeline still, from what I understand, kind of stays the way it is, but the new events that you've created have kind of created a new timeline, and it just kind of goes from there. And so, you know, I always thought to myself, what did the Avengers really save in a lot of ways when they were going back and getting, you know, the different Infinity Stones and kind of creating different timelines, right? But somehow still they end up defeating Thanos in the end and saving the day. It is a little bit convoluted, but as you're watching and the way that it's explained in the movie, it's easy to kind of just keep going with it. Now we have this show, Loki, that definitely deals with time travel. That Loki that we saw in Endgame escape with the Tesseract has now been captured by the TVA, the Time Variance Authority. And yeah, this is something I'm not super familiar with when it comes to the comic books, and it kind of excites me. I've talked about it here on the channel as a longtime Marvel and DC fan. A lot of times when I go into these movies and TV shows, I have a pretty good basis of who these characters are, what their storylines are, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm constantly expecting things. So it's nice to have something here that I'm not overly familiar with. You know, I've heard of the TVA in my comic book reading, but it's not something I'm overly familiar with. You know, you have the TVA essentially being this like government that keeps control over different timelines and kind of takes care of any sort of variances in the timeline that shouldn't be there. And there's the timekeepers that kind of try to keep this all in order. This episode does reference the multiverse and the various universes and times that are all kind of clashing, and that the timekeepers kind of keep that all in line. So that Loki that escaped in Avengers Endgame now gets captured by the TVA, and he's essentially kind of stuck with them. He doesn't have any access to his powers. He can't escape. Things like the Tesseract really have no power there, and he's now kind of in a situation where he can either be killed, be reset, or work alongside Owen Wilson's character, who is like a detective for the TVA. We see that there's been killings and there's somebody going around murdering various people who work for the TVA. We end up getting a quick moment where there's a young girl who survived one of these massacres, and Owen Wilson's character asks her, you know, who did this? And she points at a stained glass. It's in this like church, and on the stained glass is like a devil. Now the director of the show came out to let everybody know that it is not Mephisto, apparently, which is what I think a lot of people would have assumed if she didn't say that. You know, maybe it is Mephisto. Maybe she's trying to, you know, make people not really think that it is, and it actually turns out to be Mephisto. But, you know, at the end of this episode, we do end up finding out that this killer is apparently Loki, and that's why Owen Wilson's character wants him to work alongside him to kind of, I guess, capture a different version of himself. As far as the various timelines and all that kind of stuff, it just gets a little bit confusing. One thing I thought to myself, like I mentioned, was what I said earlier about the Avengers in regards to their timeline jumping and their events that they did around time travel and how they weren't really, given any consequence. And Loki actually asked about that in this episode, and they pretty much just say, well, that was supposed to happen. So it makes me wonder what would have happened if the Avengers had not decided to time travel or never found a way to time travel, in which case Thanos would have still won. Would the timekeepers and the TVA would have stepped in? I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit convenient as far as the whole time travel element, which a lot of times can be the case when you bring time travel into something. So I am curious to see how they kind of flesh that out going further into this series. Overall, I really enjoyed this episode. This episode was called Glorious Purpose, and it really kind of hones in on a character study kind of feel and vibe that this episode has around Loki. Loki ends up seeing a version of the timeline that we all know from the movies of what his life would have been had he not escaped with the Tesseract in Avengers Endgame. Again, it's weird because that eventually does really happen because that's in that original timeline, but when they go back to go and get the different Infinity Stones, that Loki escapes, which branches off another timeline, but those other timeline of films that take place from 2012 to now still happened. And so Loki actually gets to see through like this screen that shows his timeline all the events of the different things that would happen to him and the characters that he loves across the course of the other Thor films and the Avengers films that he was a part of. So he ends up seeing his mother die, ends up seeing his father die, and ends up seeing himself being killed at the hands of Thanos. So yeah, it looks like he's going to end up working with Owen Wilson's character and, kind of go on this hunt to find himself. Overall, this was a fun, zany first episode. I think some of the time travel elements, just overall, even with something like Avengers Endgame, as much as I love that movie, are going to start to get a little bit confusing, since essentially we've learned that every time something happens that kind of messes with the timeline, another branch of a timeline is created. And that's already kind of confusing because it kind of just essentially says that the last timeline still stays the same. So it's like, what are you really saving? What are you really changing? But then now you have the TVA coming to interfere with it and stopping Loki because he's apparently a variant, but what the Avengers did is not considered a variant. It's going to get a little bit confusing. I'm very curious to see how they handle it moving forward. But overall, I found the performances in the episode to be fun, the special effects to be fun. There's no big action or anything like that in this episode. This is a very much a plot-driven episode with a lot of dialogue and a very character-driven episode. One of my favorite moments in this episode was Loki being able to see the death of his mother and seeing him react to the death of his mother and kind of how his actions through this video that he's watching led to his mother dying. And that was also one of my favorite moments in Thor: The Dark World, is when he finds out that his mother is dead and Thor goes to visit him, and he kind of seems like he's completely normal. He's trying to act all cocky and normal, and eventually he ends up being vulnerable, letting down his illusion and showing Thor that he's actually quite broken, that his mother's dead. That's one of my favorite moments that Tom Hiddleston has given us as Loki, because it's so real, it's so vulnerable, and it just shows that his character is this torn and kind of tortured character. And so very much curious to see what they're going to do with him moving forward and how they're going to continue to grow his character. It seems like we're definitely going to get a lot of character growth from Loki here, more so than I think the movies have allowed him to have. And I think that they're going to utilize the events of those movies to continue to kind of flesh him out in this show. So yeah, first episode of Loki, definitely enjoyed it. Looking forward to the second episode. Did you like this episode? Did you not like this episode? How do you guys feel about the time travel and just the whole time element in the MCU? Do you also find it kind of overly convoluted as I do? Very curious to hear what you guys have to say, and I'll see you guys in the next one, all right? Bye-bye.